Everyone's wells ran dry. One man's folk magic saved 12,000 people. When Marcus Cho's shovel struck bedrock at 43 feet down, and not a single drop of water seeped through the cracks, he knew his family's century-old farm was about to die. But what he didn't know was that by sunset, 17 other wells across the valley would run dry, and the entire county would turn to him, the quiet immigrant farmer they'd dismissed for years, as their only hope for survival. Welcome to Heartfire Obsession. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It started with a sound Marcus would never forget, the hollow cough of his water pump sucking air. He was in the barn, treating a calf with hoof rot, when the engine sputtered 3 times and died. At first, he thought it was mechanical. Pumps failed. Bearings wore out. But when he walked to the well house and peered down into the darkness with his flashlight, the beam reflected nothing. Just dry stone and the faint smell of minerals. The water table that had sustained 5 generations of his wife's family had vanished overnight. Nobody believed the warning signs. Marcus had seen it coming. For 3 months, he'd been tracking the water levels in his notebook, a habit he'd learned growing up in rural Korea, where droughts could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The levels had dropped 6 inches in August, another 8 in September. By October, he was measuring daily. He'd mentioned it to Frank Delaney at the co-op, to Sheriff Morrison at the town meeting, even to his neighbor Dale who farmed the adjacent property. They'd all smiled politely. Dale had laughed. "Marcus, we've got the Snake River aquifer under us. That thing's been flowing since the dinosaurs. Your measurements are probably off." Frank had been kinder, but equally dismissive. "Maybe your well's just getting old. Mine's been steady for 30 years. Even his wife Sarah had gently suggested he was worrying too much. "You always see problems before they happen," she'd said, touching his arm. "Sometimes things are just fine." But things weren't fine. The crisis spreads like wildfire. By noon, Marcus's phone started ringing. First it was Dale, voice tight with panic. "My well's bone dry. I don't understand. It was fine yesterday." Then Frank called. Then the Hendersons. Then Mrs. Chun from the orchard. By 3 o'clock, the county emergency line had logged 47 calls. By sunset, the number had climbed to 218. The entire Southern Valley, 12,000 acres of farmland, 300 homes, 2 schools, and a hospital, had lost access to groundwater. The county called an emergency meeting at the high school gymnasium. Marcus sat in the back row with Sarah, watching nearly 800 people pack into the bleachers. Sheriff Morrison stood at the podium, face gray under the fluorescent lights. "The USGS is sending a team, but they won't arrive until Tuesday. That's 4 days. The state can truck in drinking water, but not enough for livestock, not enough for crops. We're asking everyone to conserve everything they can." A man shouted from the middle section. "Conserve what? We've got nothing left to conserve." Others joined in. The panic was thick enough to choke on. Children were crying. Farmers were calculating losses in their heads. Dairy cows that would die without water, fields that would wither, mortgages that couldn't be paid. Marcus watched it all quietly, his mind already working through possibilities no one else had considered. The dismissal that sparked everything. That's when Dale stood up. He pointed at Marcus from across the gymnasium. He knew. Marcus Cho knew this was coming. "He told me months ago, and I didn't listen." Heads turned. Hundreds of eyes suddenly focused on the quiet man in the back row. Marcus felt Sarah's hand tighten on his. The sheriff squinted. "Marcus? You got something to say?" Marcus stood slowly. He wasn't comfortable with crowds. His English was good but accented, and he'd learned over the years that people heard the accent before they heard the words. "I tracked the water table for 3 months, he said, voice steady. "It's not just dropping. It's gone. But not everywhere. The aquifer shifted. It does this sometimes in seismic zones. There are micro-earthquakes we don't feel. The water doesn't disappear. It moves." A woman near the front laughed nervously. "So where'd it move to?" "Magic land." Others chuckled. It was the kind of dismissive laughter that came from fear dressed as skepticism. Marcus didn't flinch. "It moved downslope. Probably northwest, where the bedrock angles. There's an old survey from 1952 that shows underground channels. If we can find where those channels lead." "We don't have time for treasure hunts," a man interrupted. "We need real solutions. We need the state to act." The crowd murmured agreement. Marcus sat back down. Sarah leaned close. They didn't listen before. They won't listen now. He nodded. But he was already forming a plan, one that would require tools they didn't have, knowledge they dismissed, and a level of ingenuity no one thought he possessed. The secret everyone forgot. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with maps spread in every direction, geological surveys, satellite images, old property records from the county archives. His grandfather had taught him something most modern farmers had forgotten. Water always tells you where it's going if you know how to read the signs. In Korea, farmers used willow branches, iron rods, and something his grandfather called listening to the earth. Most people called it dowsing, pseudoscience, folk magic. But Marcus had used it to find 3 springs on his property that no surveyor had detected. He traced his finger along the topology map. There, a depression 3 miles northwest, just beyond the Peterson Ranch. The land dipped sharply, then leveled out near a stand of cottonwoods. Cottonwoods meant water. Always. Their roots could reach 100 feet down. If the aquifer had shifted, if the underground channels were still flowing, that's where the water would resurface. He could feel it. But proving it would mean going against every expert who'd already declared the aquifer dead. At dawn, Marcus loaded his truck. Sarah watched from the doorway. "You really think you can find it?" He paused, one hand on the truck door. "I know I can, but they have to believe it's possible first." She smiled, that small knowing smile he'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. Then make them believe. The risk no one saw coming. By 8 a.m., word had spread. Not officially. There'd been no announcement. But in the way small towns communicate. Phone calls, texts, conversations at the gas station. Marcus Cho thinks he can find water. People showed up at his farm. Some curious, some desperate, some outright hostile. Dale was there, hat in his hands, apologizing. Frank brought coffee. Sheriff Morrison arrived with 2 deputies, not to stop him, but to ask questions. Marcus showed them the maps, explained the seismic shifts, the channels, the cottonwood groves. Some nodded. Others looked skeptical. One man, a geologist from the university who'd driven down overnight, actually laughed. "Dowsing? You're basing this on dowsing." Marcus met his eyes. "I'm basing it on observation, history, and patterns. The dowsing just confirms what the land is already telling me." "This is insane," the geologist said, turning to the sheriff. "You can't let people put their hopes in folk superstition. The aquifer is dry. The USGS will confirm it. We need to focus on trucking water and rationing what we have." But the sheriff looked at Marcus, then at the crowd gathering outside the barn. Families with empty water jugs. Farmers with dying cattle. He made a decision that would either save the valley or destroy what little hope remained. "Show us," Morrison said. "You've got 48 hours before the state steps in with emergency measures. If you're right, you'll be a hero. If you're wrong." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The journey begins. Marcus drove northwest with a caravan behind him. 20 trucks, a dozen families, the skeptical geologist, and a local news crew that had caught wind of the story. Sarah rode beside him, their teenage daughter Emma in the back seat. "What if you're wrong?" Emma whispered. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Then we learned something. That's never wrong." But as they crested the hill overlooking the Peterson Ranch, and Marcus saw the cottonwood grove in the distance exactly where his maps predicted, he felt something he rarely allowed himself: certainty. The trees were greener than anything else in the valley, their leaves thick despite months of drought. Water was there. He could feel it in his bones. But finding it would require digging where no one had ever thought to look, trusting methods science had abandoned, and convincing an entire community that sometimes the old ways knew more than the new ones. As the convoy pulled to a stop, Marcus stepped out of his truck and picked up the willow branch he'd cut at dawn. The crowd gathered behind him, silent now, watching. And in that moment, with 800 eyes on him and the future of 12,000 acres hanging in the balance, Marcus Cho did something that would either validate everything he believed or destroy his credibility forever. He closed his eyes, held the branch loosely in both hands, and began to walk slowly across the dry earth, listening for something only he could hear. The branch twitched once, then twice, then bent sharply downward so fast it almost jerked from his hands. The crowd gasped. The geologist scoffed. But Marcus opened his eyes and planted a stake in the ground. "Here," he said. "Dig here." And as the first shovel bit into the earth, no one knew yet that Marcus had just made the most dangerous gamble of his life. Because 3 feet down, they would find something no one expected, and it would change everything. The first shovel sank 3 feet before it struck something that made a hollow sound. Not rock, but something man-made. Dale stopped digging, confused. What the hell? Marcus knelt at the edge of the hole, brushing dirt away with his hands. Metal. Curved. Old. Very old. Within minutes they'd uncovered it. A cast-iron pipe, 8 inches in diameter, running perpendicular to where they were digging. It was part of an old irrigation system, pre-1950s by the look of the corrosion, something built and forgotten when the wells came in. The geologist climbed down into the growing pit. He ran his hand along the pipe, frowning. This is part of the old Cascade project. They abandoned it in '48 when the wells proved more reliable. These pipes run for miles, most of them collapsed or filled with sediment. He looked at Marcus with something between confusion and suspicion. How did you know this was here? Marcus didn't answer directly. The pipe isn't what matters. It's what the pipe was following. He pointed northwest, toward the deeper cottonwood grove another half-mile away. Water always finds the path of least resistance. Whoever built this system knew where the natural channels were. They were following what was already there underground. We need to keep digging. But as more earth came out of the hole, they found something else. Markings scratched into the metal, worn but still visible. Coordinates, distances, and a warning in faded paint. Risk of collapse. Do not excavate beyond marker 7. Nobody knew what marker 7 meant. But Marcus had a suspicion, and it filled him with a cold dread he didn't show on his face. The first signs of water. By noon they'd dug 6 feet down, following the pipe northwest. The crowd had grown. Word spread fast, not just through the valley, but to neighboring counties. News crews arrived from 3 different stations. The county supervisor showed up, talking about permits and liability. But nobody stopped digging because at 6 feet and 4 inches, the first man's shovel hit moisture. Not wet dirt. Not mud. Actual standing water, pooling at the bottom of the trench. A cheer went up from the crowd. Dale pulled up a handful of damp earth, laughing. He was right. Marcus was right. But Marcus didn't celebrate. He crouched at the edge, studying the water carefully. It was flowing, but slowly, seeping laterally through layers of compressed clay and gravel. This wasn't the main channel yet. This was runoff, a side vein. The real source was still deeper, still farther northwest. And that meant they'd have to dig into territory the old engineers had deliberately avoided. Sarah handed him a bottle of water. He drank half, then poured the rest over his head, washing away dust and sweat. "You're worried," she said quietly. He nodded. The old system was abandoned for a reason. Marker 7 means they hit something unstable. If we dig past that point. He didn't finish. She understood. Unstable ground could mean sinkholes, collapse, underground caverns that could swallow equipment and people without warning. So what do we do? He looked at the eager faces around them, at families filling jugs with the tiny trickle of water emerging from the trench, at children splashing in puddles for the first time in days. We dig carefully. The opposition grows stronger. Not everyone was celebrating. By early afternoon, a group had formed at the edge of the site, landowners from adjacent properties, the geologist from the university, and a lawyer representing 3 farming corporations that controlled much of the northern valley. Their argument was simple. Marcus had no permits, no engineering study, no environmental impact assessment. What he was doing was illegal, dangerous, and could contaminate what little water remained. The lawyer was a thin man in a suit too nice for a construction site, picking his way through the mud with visible disgust. "Mr. Cho, I'm serving you with a cease and desist order on behalf of Peterson AG Holdings and 2 other entities. This excavation is on private property without authorization, and you're potentially damaging underground infrastructure." Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans. "I have Dale Peterson's permission. He's standing right there." Dale nodded confirmation. The lawyer barely glanced at him. "Mr. Peterson doesn't own the mineral and water rights. Those were sold in 1987. My clients do, and they're instructing you to stop immediately." Sheriff Morrison stepped between them. "Son, people are out of water. We've got livestock dying. Unless you've got a better solution, I'm using emergency authority to let this continue." The lawyer's smile was cold. Then you'll be named in the lawsuit too, Sheriff. My clients will pursue damages for every gallon of water diverted from their legal claims. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. This man is promising you water that doesn't belong to any of you. He's using folk magic and luck to dig holes in the ground. When this fails, and it will fail, you'll have nothing but debt and broken hope. Some people wavered. Others looked at Marcus with new suspicion. Who was he to promise them salvation? A small-time farmer who'd barely been in the county 15 years? Emma grabbed her father's arm. Dad, maybe we should stop. Maybe they're right. But Marcus saw something the others didn't. He saw the lawyer's shoes, expensive leather, imported, still somehow perfectly clean despite standing at a muddy dig site. He saw how the man stood upwind, how he kept his distance from the actual work. This wasn't about water rights or legality. This was about control. We keep digging, Marcus said. And the crowd, despite their doubts, followed him deeper. The hidden knowledge. That night, while others rested, Marcus returned to his truck and pulled out something he'd kept hidden, his grandfather's journal, written in Korean with hand-drawn diagrams. He'd brought it from Seoul 20 years ago, never thinking he'd need it. But now, by flashlight, he translated passages he'd memorized as a child. His grandfather had been a water engineer during the war, finding sources for villages that had been bombed or displaced. The journal contained techniques most modern engineers had forgotten: how to read mineral deposits, how to calculate underground flow by surface vegetation, how to detect cavities and voids by the sound the earth made when you struck it. There was a section on dangerous excavations, on sinkholes and collapses. His grandfather had lost 2 men to a cave-in in 1952, and he'd written extensively about the warning signs. Marcus read them carefully, then walked the perimeter of the dig site in the dark, tapping the ground with a steel rod, listening. The earth sounded different here, hollow in places, dense in others. He marked 3 areas with orange flags. These were dangerous zones. They'd have to dig around them, not through them. When he returned to the fire where Dale and Frank were drinking coffee, they asked what he'd found. Problems, Marcus said, but also a path through them. He spread a hand-drawn map on the hood of his truck, showing where they needed to redirect the trench, where they needed to shore up the walls, where they absolutely could not dig. Frank studied it skeptically. This is going to take twice as long. We don't have twice as long. Marcus met his eyes. Would you rather be fast or alive? The breakthrough and the collapse. By dawn of the second day, they dug past marker 7. The pipe they'd been following ended abruptly at a concrete junction box, cracked and partially collapsed. Inside, 3 channels split off in different directions. Marcus studied them carefully, then pointed to the smallest one, angling sharply down. That one. It was a guess based on topography, on his grandfather's teachings, on instinct. They widened the trench, reinforcing the walls with timber, and followed the channel deeper. At 9 feet, they broke through into an underground cavity. Not a sinkhole, something natural, a limestone dissolution chamber about the size of a small room. And at the bottom, flowing clear and cold, was water. Not a trickle, not a seep, a stream, moving fast, maybe 20 gallons a minute, cutting through the chamber floor and continuing northwest through a natural channel they could barely see in the flashlight beam. Dale climbed down, scooped up a handful, and drank. His eyes went wide. It's perfect. It's better than well water. That's when the wall collapsed. It happened fast. A section of trench wall, undermined by the water they'd exposed, gave way with a sound like thunder. Earth poured down, burying the timber supports, sending men scrambling backward. One man, Frank's nephew, barely 20 years old, slipped and fell into the chamber. His leg twisted at an angle that made people scream. The water level rose instantly, now up to his waist. Marcus didn't think. He grabbed a rope, tied it around his waist, and jumped into the cavity. The water was shockingly cold, numbing his legs immediately. He reached the young man, lifted him, and shouted for others to pull. They hauled both men out just as another section of wall crumbled. The chamber was collapsing, slowly but inevitably, the weight of earth above pressing down. The geologist, who'd been watching with arms crossed, suddenly wasn't skeptical anymore. He was terrified. Everyone back. This whole site could go. But Marcus stood at the edge, watching the water still flowing through the chaos. He turned to the sheriff. We need pumps. Heavy-duty ones. We need to tap this stream before the cavity closes completely. We've got maybe 6 hours. Morrison stared at him. You're insane. We just almost lost someone. Marcus nodded. And we'll lose everyone if we don't finish this. The race against time. What followed was the most desperate engineering effort the valley had ever seen. While some people evacuated, others brought equipment. Pumps from irrigation systems, generators, PVC piping, anything that could move water. Marcus directed them like a general, positioning pumps at angles that would draw from the stream without destabilizing the cavity further. They worked in shifts, in teams, with people passing tools hand to hand. Sarah ran logistics, coordinating supply runs. Emma, despite her fear, helped lay pipe across the field to temporary storage tanks they'd trucked in. The geologist, now covered in mud and fully invested, helped calculate flow rates. If we can get 40 gallons a minute to the surface, we can supply the whole valley for weeks while they drill proper wells. But every hour the cavity sank lower, squeezed by geological pressure. They could hear it groaning, could see cracks spreading across the chamber's ceiling. Twice more they had to evacuate. Once when a sinkhole opened 30 feet away. Once when a support beam cracked. But Marcus kept working, kept calculating, kept trusting that the water would hold long enough. By sunset of the second day, they had 3 pumps operational. Water flowed through 200 yards of temporary pipeline into a tanker truck. The first families filled their containers. Children drank their fill. Cattle were watered. And Marcus, exhausted beyond measure, sat on the edge of the trench and let himself feel something he rarely permitted, pride. But it was Sarah who saw it first. She was walking the pipeline, checking for leaks, when she found the crack. Not in their pipes. In the old irrigation pipe they'd discovered at the start. It was spreading, a hairline fracture widening under the pressure of the new water flow. And if it gave way completely, every gallon they'd fought for would drain into the earth before reaching anyone. She ran back to Marcus. We have a problem. The crack in the old irrigation pipe was 18 inches long and growing. Marcus could hear it. A faint hissing sound as water found its way through the fracture, disappearing into the surrounding soil. At their current flow rate, they were losing maybe 5 gallons a minute. Not catastrophic yet, but within hours it would widen enough to collapse the entire section. And if that happened, the water would drain into the earth before reaching a single storage tank. Everything they'd risked, everything they'd built, would dissolve into the ground like hope through fingers. Frank saw the problem immediately. We need to shut down the pumps and repair it. But Marcus shook his head. Shutting down means losing pressure. The cavity's still collapsing. If we stop now, we might not be able to restart. The geologist, now an unlikely ally, ran calculations in his notebook. He's right. The cavity's compression rate is accelerating. We've got maybe 90 minutes before it closes completely. After that, this water source is gone forever. Dale swore under his breath. So we're trapped. Can't stop, can't continue. Emma, standing quietly beside her father, spoke up. What if you don't repair it? What if you reinforce it? Everyone turned to look at the 16-year-old girl. She'd been watching the whole operation for 2 days, absorbing every detail with the same quiet intensity as her father. In engineering class, we learned about sleeving. If you can't replace a pipe, you build around it. Support the weak point without stopping the flow. Marcus felt something click. His daughter had just solved in 30 seconds what none of them had seen. We need sheet metal, epoxy, and compression clamps. Fast. The ingenuity of desperation. What they built in the next 70 minutes would have made any engineer shake their head, except it worked. Using sheet metal salvage from an old barn, industrial epoxy from someone's garage, and compression clamps meant for hydraulic hoses, they fashioned a sleeve around the cracked section of pipe. They couldn't stop the water, couldn't even slow it down, so they worked around the flow, sealing what they could, reinforcing what they couldn't, building up layers of protection like armor over a wound. Marcus worked with his hands in the water, fingers numb, while Sarah mixed epoxy in a bucket, passing it to him in careful portions. Emma held the flashlight steady, never wavering, even when another section of trench wall crumbled nearby. The geologist, his name was Dr. Raymond Chun, they'd finally learned, calculated cure times and pressure tolerances. Even the lawyer who'd tried to shut them down was there now, holding tools, having abandoned his lawsuit somewhere in the mud and chaos of survival. "This is the most irresponsible thing I've ever been part of," Dr. Chen said, almost admiringly, as they tightened the final clamp. "No permits, no safety review, no engineering analysis. But damn if it isn't brilliant." Marcus didn't smile. He was watching the pressure gauge on the nearest pump. If the sleeve held, the pressure would stabilize. If it failed, they'd see a drop within seconds. The needle wavered, dipped slightly, then held steady. Then, impossibly, it rose. The reinforcement was working. Water that had been leaking was now flowing where they directed it. A cheer went up from the crowd. But Marcus held up a hand for silence. "We're not done yet. The final test." The cavity collapsed completely at hour 87. They heard it go, a deep, rumbling sound like distant thunder, followed by a compression wave that made the ground shift beneath their feet. The chamber that had taken them 2 days to reach was gone, crushed under thousands of tons of earth. But the stream they'd tapped continued flowing, now channeled through their makeshift system, emerging from the ground through 3 pumps working in synchronized rhythm. By midnight, they'd filled 6 tanker trucks. By dawn, they'd filled 20. The water flowed clear and cold, tested by the county and found to be not just safe, but exceptional, cleaner than most municipal supplies, filtered through layers of limestone that removed impurities and added minerals. Within a week, they'd set up a distribution system. Within 2 weeks, temporary wells were being drilled using Marcus's maps to locate stable access points. Within a month, the valley had more water than it had before the crisis began. But the real test came 6 weeks later, when the USGS report was finally published. The lead geologist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Winters, stood in the same gymnasium where the emergency meeting had been held. She projected maps on the screen, showing underground flow patterns, seismic shifts, and aquifer movements that matched Marcus's predictions almost exactly. "The original aquifer didn't disappear," she explained to a packed room. "It shifted northwest along a fault line we hadn't properly mapped." Mr. Cho's analysis of historical patterns, combined with his unconventional methods, led him to the precise location where the water resurfaced. Without his intervention, this valley would have taken 3 years to recover. With it, you recovered in 3 weeks. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then everyone was standing. Marcus, sitting in the same back row where he'd been dismissed weeks earlier, felt Sarah's hand find his. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't stand, didn't take a bow, just nodded once, acknowledging what he'd always known, that sometimes the old ways, the dismissed ways, the ways people mocked, held wisdom that modern certainty had forgotten. The transformation. The valley changed after that, not just in its infrastructure, but in its understanding. People started paying attention to what Marcus had always noticed, the patterns in nature, the signs in the land, the knowledge embedded in practices their grandparents had known. His farm became a teaching center. Schools brought students to learn about water systems. Counties from across the state sent engineers to study his methods. The university where Dr. Chen taught added a course on traditional ecological knowledge, with Marcus as a guest lecturer. But the most profound changes were smaller, personal. Dale Peterson, who'd once dismissed Marcus's warnings, now consulted him before making any major farming decisions. Frank started a notebook of his own, tracking weather patterns and soil moisture. Mrs. Chun from the orchard taught her grandchildren the Korean phrases Marcus had taught her for reading the land. And Emma, who'd always been good at science, decided she wanted to become a hydrological engineer, one who valued both data and intuition, both technology and tradition. The corporations that had tried to shut down the dig, they quietly dropped their lawsuit. The water rights they'd claimed were deemed invalid after the county rewrote its ordinances, prioritizing community access over corporate control. The lawyer who'd served the cease and desist order left the valley and didn't return. And the geologist who'd mocked dowsing as pseudoscience published a paper titled Traditional Ecological Knowledge in Modern Resource Management, a case study in unexpected validity. The recognition nobody wanted. Marcus Cho was offered awards. The governor wanted to give him a medal. News organizations wanted interviews. A documentary crew spent 2 weeks following him around. He declined most of it, not out of humility, though he was humble, but because he knew what would happen if he became a symbol. People would stop seeing the work and start seeing the man. They'd either put him on a pedestal or tear him down. Both outcomes would miss the point. What he did accept was a small ceremony at the high school, organized by the students. Emma had helped plan it. They presented him with a hand-carved sign, made from the timber they'd used to shore up the trench. It read, "The Water Whisperer." Marcus smiled at that. It was better than most of the names they'd called him before. During his brief speech, he said something the students would remember for years. "I didn't find the water because I was special. I found it because I was paying attention. Anyone can learn to pay attention. Most people just don't think they need to." That phrase, "most people just don't think they need to," became something of a motto in the valley. It showed up on t-shirts, on bumper stickers, on the wall of the co-op. It was a gentle rebuke to the arrogance that had nearly cost them everything, and a reminder that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, in unexpected forms, spoken with unexpected accents. The legacy that kept growing. 5 years later, the valley was thriving. Not just surviving, but genuinely prospering. The crisis had forced a transformation in how people thought about resources, about community, about whose knowledge mattered. 3 new water systems had been built using Marcus's principles. A regional water management council had formed, with representatives from every community, explicitly including voices that had been marginalized before: immigrant farmers, indigenous knowledge keepers, small landholders who understood the land in ways corporate operations never would. Marcus's farm expanded, not because he wanted it bigger, but because young farmers kept asking to apprentice there. He taught them the same things his grandfather had taught him: how to read weather patterns and insect behavior, how to detect underground water by the growth patterns of deep-rooted plants, how to build resilient systems that worked with nature instead of against it. Some thought his methods were mystical. Others thought they were simply practical knowledge dressed in unfamiliar clothes. Marcus didn't care which interpretation people preferred, as long as they learned. Emma graduated from college with degrees in both civil engineering and environmental science. Her senior thesis was on integrating traditional ecological knowledge with modern hydrological modeling. She built a computer program that could predict aquifer shifts by analyzing the same indicators her father had used: vegetation patterns, mineral deposits, seismic microvariations, and translating them into data points engineers could understand. The program was adopted by 3 state water management agencies. When reporters asked her where she got her ideas, she always said the same thing: "My father taught me to pay attention." The circle completes. One autumn evening, 7 years after the crisis, Marcus was working in his shed when a truck pulled up. Expensive, new, clearly not local. A young man stepped out, nervous, holding a folder. "Mr. Cho? I'm Daniel Morrison, the sheriff's nephew. I don't know if you remember me." Marcus remembered. He was the young man who'd fallen into the cavity, who'd been injured during the collapse. "Your leg healed well." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, barely even a scar. I wanted to show you something." He opened the folder, revealing architectural drawings. "I'm a civil engineer now. I just got contracted to design a water system for a community in Nevada facing drought conditions. And I'm using your methods, the gravity flow designs, the natural filtration, the monitoring systems you developed. I wanted your permission and your advice." Marcus looked at the drawings carefully. They were good, professionally rendered, technically sound, but missing something essential. He pointed to a section. "Here, this channel. You're fighting the land's natural slope. Work with it instead. And here, you need ventilation in your catchment system. Water needs to breathe, just like wood." They spent 2 hours going over the plans. Daniel took notes, asked questions, absorbed every detail with the hungry attention of someone who'd learned what it meant to be unprepared. As Daniel was leaving, he paused. "Mr. Cho, when I was lying at the bottom of that cavity, leg broken, water rising, I thought I was going to die. And then you jumped in. You didn't hesitate. People said later you were crazy for risking it, that you should have let the professionals handle it. But there weren't any professionals. There was just you, and you were enough." He shook his head, emotional. "I wanted to say thank you. And I wanted to tell you that every water system I design, I'm going to think about that moment. I'm going to ask myself, what would Marcus Cho do?" After Daniel left, Sarah found Marcus standing in the yard, looking toward the northwest where the old dig site had been. It was a memorial now, a small park with the carved wooden sign, a plaque listing everyone who'd helped, and a fountain fed by the same stream they'd tapped 7 years ago. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My grandfather. He would have liked to see this. He spent his whole life trying to convince people that the old knowledge mattered, that we shouldn't throw away everything our ancestors learned. He died thinking he'd failed." Sarah put her arm around him. "He didn't fail. He taught you. And you taught them. The wisdom that endures." The story of Marcus Cho and the water crisis became one of those tales that communities tell themselves, that gets passed down through generations, growing richer with each retelling. Some versions focused on the engineering, the dramatic rescue, the conflict with corporations. Others emphasized the cultural clash, the dismissal of immigrant knowledge, the eventual recognition. But the version Marcus preferred, the one he told students who came to learn, was simpler. "I grew up in a place where water was survival," he'd say. "We didn't have the luxury of ignoring what the land was telling us. When I came here, I brought that knowledge with me. But knowledge isn't worth anything if no one listens. The real miracle wasn't finding the water. It was convincing people to look for it in the first place." He'd pause, letting that sink in.